What happens when battle-hardened warriors come face to face with something that defies everything they know about combat, survival, and reality itself? Tonight, you're about to discover why two decorated military veterans refuse to speak their experiences aloud until now. These aren't your typical campfire ghost stories or internet folklore passed down through generations of embellishment. These are first-hand accounts from men trained to handle the unthinkable, individuals who've stared death in the eye on foreign battlefields, yet found themselves completely unprepared for what they encountered in the wilderness of their own homeland. The first veteran served multiple tours overseas, earning commendations for bravery under fire. The second spent decades perfecting woodland survival skills that kept him alive in some of the world's most dangerous terrain. Both men share one haunting similarity: they haven't enjoyed a peaceful night in the forest since their encounters with something that hunts with intelligence, patience, and a predatory cunning that surpasses anything in nature's known arsenal. Before we dive into these accounts, let me paint you a picture that might explain why these encounters aren't as rare as we'd like to believe. Researchers have mapped disappearances across North America's wilderness areas, creating a disturbing pattern that overlays almost perfectly with extensive underground cave networks. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when you factor in the remote locations where military personnel are stationed, places where civilization's footprint barely exists, suddenly these encounters begin forming a much darker pattern. Our first account comes from a decorated Marine who we'll call Marcus. After completing his deployment in Afghanistan, Marcus returned to his childhood stomping grounds in Nevada's high desert region, where sparse pine forests meet endless scrubland. This landscape, harsh and unforgiving, had been his playground since childhood. Every rock formation, every game trail, every water source within a 50-mile radius was as familiar to him as his own reflection. Marcus had always been the type of soldier who thrived in hostile environments. His superiors often joked that he was more comfortable sleeping under desert stars than in a proper barracks. So when local ranchers began losing livestock to what they assumed was a particularly aggressive coyote pack, Marcus volunteered to solve the problem alongside his childhood friend Jake, a fellow Marine fresh from basic training. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Coyotes are creatures of habit, predictable in their hunting patterns and territorial behaviors. They'd identified the pack's general hunting grounds through careful observation of livestock kills and scat analysis. Night hunting would give them the advantage. Coyotes' vocalizations would betray their locations long before visual contact. What they didn't anticipate was becoming prey themselves. The evening started normally, temperature dropping steadily as desert gave way to evening's embrace. Both men carried high-powered rifles suitable for medium-range predator control. Marcus shouldered his trusted .308, while Jake carried a reliable .306, enough firepower to drop any North American predator with a single well-placed shot. As they approached the suspected den area, familiar coyote vocalizations echoed through the sparse timber. Injured pup calls, distressed yipping, textbook predator communication that should have triggered their hunting instincts. Instead, something felt fundamentally wrong. The sounds were too perfect, too strategically placed, too calculated. Experienced hunters develop an intuition about their quarry, an almost supernatural ability to predict animal behavior based on subtle environmental cues. Both Marines felt this intuition screaming warnings, but neither could articulate exactly what was triggering their alarm bells. They employed standard predator hunting tactics, splitting up to create overlapping fields of fire while maintaining visual contact. The distressed animal calls continued, always seeming to originate from just beyond their effective shooting range, always drawing them deeper into unfamiliar terrain. What happened next challenged everything these combat veterans understood about predator behavior, tactical awareness, and the natural world itself. Marcus takes up the narrative. "We'd been tracking these calls for maybe 20 minutes when Jake grabbed my shoulder and whispered that we needed to reassess the situation. The sounds we'd been following weren't moving like any coyote pack he'd ever encountered. They were coordinated, strategic, almost like they were being directed by some form of intelligence." The realization hit both men simultaneously. They weren't hunting coyotes. Something was hunting them. They immediately implemented escape and evasion protocols, moving back toward their vehicle while maintaining tactical spacing and situational awareness. But the calls continued, now clearly following their movement, adapting to their route changes, anticipating their tactical decisions. "That's when we saw it," Marcus recalls. his voice still carrying the weight of that night, years later. Jake called out movement at our 2 o'clock position, maybe 60 yards out. What emerged from the tree line wasn't a coyote, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything either of us had encountered in multiple combat deployments or years of wilderness experience. The creature stood upright, towering above the surrounding vegetation at an estimated 8 to 9 feet in height. Its gait was bipedal, but wrong somehow, too fluid, too purposeful for anything that should exist in North American wilderness. Both Marines engaged immediately, their military training overriding the psychological shock of the encounter. Marcus's 30-08 barked first, followed by Jake's 30-06, center mass shots that should have immediately incapacitated any living target. The creature barely reacted. We kept firing, convinced that shock or adrenaline was affecting our accuracy, Marcus continues. 15 rounds between us, and this thing just stood there absorbing the impacts like we were throwing pebbles. Then it turned perpendicular to our position and walked away with the casual indifference of something that knew we posed absolutely no threat. The psychological impact proved more devastating than any physical confrontation they'd experienced in overseas combat. These were men trained to neutralize human threats, individuals who'd successfully engaged enemy combatants in life-or-death situations. Yet they found themselves completely helpless against something that appeared to view their most powerful weapons as minor annoyances. Post-encounter investigation revealed the true scope of their manipulation. The actual coyote den was located 11 miles in the opposite direction from where they'd been led. Whatever had mimicked those distress calls had intimate knowledge of their hunting methods, their psychological responses, even their ammunition capacity. We found evidence of a deliberate deception campaign, Marcus explains. Scat deposits from multiple coyote pack members had been strategically placed throughout the area where we'd been hunting. Territorial markings, feeding sign, everything you'd expect to find around an active den site, but it was all staged, all placed there to support the acoustic deception we'd been experiencing. The implications are staggering. This suggests intelligence-level planning, understanding of human psychology, and manipulation capabilities that exceed anything documented in zoological literature. Marcus concludes his account with a sobering admission. Jake and I still hunt when necessary for food or population control, but we've never again operated alone in wilderness areas after dark. Something out there is intelligent enough to study human behavior, patient enough to execute complex long-term deceptions, and powerful enough to render our most effective weapons completely useless. That's not a predator, that's an apex intelligence that views humans as potential prey. Our second account originates from the rugged terrain of eastern Tennessee, specifically the Walden Ridge area, a massive plateau that stretches across much of the state. This story comes from a veteran we'll call David, whose encounter spans multiple time periods and reveals even more disturbing aspects of these creatures' capabilities. David grew up in a tiny mountain community of barely 200 residents, surrounded entirely by dense forest bordering protected wildlife reserves. In a community where hunting, hiking, and woodland survival were essential life skills, David had achieved almost legendary status for his ability to navigate the most challenging terrain in complete darkness, track wounded game across miles of difficult ground, and survive extended periods in the wilderness with minimal equipment. His first introduction to the local phenomenon occurred when he was 12 years old, riding an old minibike along abandoned logging roads that crisscrossed the mountain. These forgotten trails, carved originally by wagon wheels and later deepened by early automobiles, provided access to areas where few people ventured. During one solo exploration, David emerged from a particularly remote hollow to find an elderly local resident waiting on her front porch. This woman, whose family had resided in the area for generations dating back to Tennessee's earliest settlements, immediately questioned whether he'd traveled through the Forbidden Hollow. When David confirmed his route, the woman's reaction was immediate and intense. She insisted he never returned to that area, explaining that there was a specific reason the old road had been deliberately blocked. The story she shared that afternoon introduced David to the local legend of Whistling Jack, a creature whose name reflected the community's practical approach to identifying wildlife by their distinctive characteristics, similar to calling a particular species of quail bobwhite due to its unique vocalization. According to the woman's family history, dating back to the early 1900s, two neighboring families, the Browns and the Smiths, had established small farms on opposite sides of the Forbidden Hollow. Twice monthly, the young men from both families would gather for evening socializing that typically concluded well before midnight, as these were working farms that operated on strict sunrise to sunset schedules. One particular Saturday night, the gathering extended unusually late, with the Brown brothers not departing for home until well past 1 o'clock in the morning. Their route home required crossing a small creek at the bottom of the hollow, a crossing marked by a large boulder that overlooked the entire area. As the three brothers approached the creek crossing, a bird call echoed from atop the boulder. The sound itself seemed innocuous, but it triggered immediate panic responses in their horses. Two of the three mounts bolted across the creek and up the opposite trail at full gallop, but the youngest brother's horse reared so violently that it threw him to the ground. The falling lantern could have meant death in total darkness, but fortune smiled. It landed in soft sand without breaking, providing crucial illumination for what followed. The thrown rider found himself staring up at two large red eyes positioned atop the boulder. The creature emitted another whistle-like call before launching itself directly at his terrified horse. He emptied his entire cylinder into that thing, the old woman had told David, her grip tightening on his arm. 6 rapid shots from a .45 at point-blank range, and it still managed to take down his horse before disappearing into the forest. When his brothers returned, they found him trying to reload with shaking hands, his horse dead from massive throat trauma. The creature's description matched nothing in known zoological references: bipedal, covered in dark shaggy hair, moving with a stooped-over gait, and emanating a powerful stench that lingered long after its departure. The following morning, armed family members returned to recover the saddle and equipment, expecting to find the horse carcass and potentially track a wounded creature. Instead, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of natural predator behavior. The horse had vanished completely. All equipment, saddle, bridle, and gear had been removed. The sand around the attack site had been systematically brushed clean, as if swept with pine branches. Even the blood evidence had been partially obscured. No tracks remained. No trail led away from the scene. Whatever had killed the horse possessed the intelligence to eliminate physical evidence and the strength to remove an entire horse carcass without leaving detectable traces. This encounter established a generational warning that David foolishly disregarded 13 years later. At 25, following military service and a brief unsuccessful marriage, David found himself back on the mountain, struggling with depression. The forest had always provided him with psychological peace, particularly one specific location, several hundred yards from sandstone cliffs that bordered the western edge of the plateau. This location featured an old-growth pine grove where massive trees created a natural cathedral effect. The thick canopy prevented undergrowth development, resulting in a carpet of pine needles that muffled footsteps and created an atmosphere of profound tranquility. Beds of moss provided natural seating areas that made extended meditation possible. David had spent the entire afternoon and evening hiking along the base of the cliffs, carrying a small backpack with food, water, bourbon, and multiple flashlights for cave exploration. His weapon of choice was a Winchester Model 97 12-gauge shotgun, a reliable pump action that held 5 rounds in the magazine plus 1 chambered. Around midnight, while enjoying the valley lights visible from his elevated position, David heard a bobwhite call from the wooded slope below his location. For several seconds, this seemed perfectly normal. Then his wilderness experience kicked in, and he realized that bobwhites are quail, strictly diurnal birds that never vocalize after dark. A second bobwhite call answered from the north, approximately at David's elevation. The first caller responded, but now from a position significantly closer to David's location. "I've never been easily frightened," David explains. "Growing up in these woods, serving overseas, I understood how to assess and respond to genuine threats, but this was completely outside my experience base. Bobwhites simply don't operate at night, and they don't coordinate movement patterns like military units." David immediately began moving toward the cliffs, avoiding his flashlight to prevent revealing his position. As he moved, he retrieved electrical tape from his backpack and began securing one flashlight to his shotgun's magazine tube, creating an improvised tactical light system. The false bobwhite calls continued, always answering each other, always coordinating their positions relative to David's movement. Worse, he began hearing heavy footsteps that seemed to mirror his own pace and direction. "That's when I remembered the old woman's story from 13 years earlier," David recalls. "I realized I was experiencing something similar to what those Brown brothers had encountered: intelligent creatures using acoustic mimicry to coordinate hunting behavior." David's military training provided him with tactical options unavailable to 19th-century farmers. He knew the terrain intimately, including a specific escape route that would be nearly impossible for large creatures to follow. Directly above his position, the cliff face contained a deep crevice formed by thousands of years of freeze-thaw cycles in the layered sandstone. This crevice created an inverted V shape about 4 feet wide at the base, extending 30 feet back into the cliff face. Along the left side of this crevice, geological forces had created a narrow ledge that rose from the rear of the crack to an opening near the top of the cliff. The opening was barely large enough for a human to squeeze through, but it provided access to a ledge 30 feet up the cliff face. From this ledge, additional rock formations created a climbing route to the top of the cliff, bypassing the otherwise impassable vertical rock face. David reached this escape route while the creatures were still positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated attack. The tight squeeze through the crevice opening required pushing his backpack and shotgun ahead of him, leaving him momentarily vulnerable, but the alternative was facing unknown numbers of large, intelligent predators in open terrain. I could hear them shuffling around at the base of the cliff as I climbed, David explains. For some reason, they didn't follow me into the crevice. Maybe they were too large. Maybe they didn't understand the route, but they definitely knew I'd escaped because I could hear them moving around down there, trying to figure out where I'd gone. Upon reaching the top of the cliff, David ran directly to the center of the old-growth pine grove, positioned himself against one of the massive trees, and prepared for a defensive engagement. The psychological security of having something solid behind him, combined with the tactical advantage of elevation and prepared positions, helped stabilize his combat mindset. But the creatures had somehow reached the top of the cliff. I have no idea how they managed that climb, David admits. The cliff stretched for over a mile in both directions with no other access routes that I knew of. The crevice crawl was the only way up, but there they were, somehow positioned at the edge of the grove. The creatures employed sophisticated tactics, remaining just inside the tree line where David's improvised weapon light couldn't penetrate, but close enough that their footsteps were clearly audible. They moved with deliberate coordination, circling the grove while maintaining concealment, obviously searching for an approach route that would give them tactical advantage. David's patience expired before theirs did. He fired 2 shotgun blasts toward the area where he'd last heard movement, hoping to either score hits or discourage further approach. The response was unlike anything he'd encountered in military service or civilian life. The scream that followed my shots was absolutely inhuman, David recalls, his voice still carrying the psychological impact of that moment. It wasn't pain, it wasn't fear, it was pure rage. Imagine the angriest primate vocalization you've ever heard, then amplify it 10 times and drop the pitch into something that bypasses your rational mind and speaks directly to your primal terror responses. The creatures immediately withdrew, crashing through the forest away from David's position, but rather than pursuing them or attempting to verify hits, David remained in defensive position until daylight, his weapon trained on the tree line, waiting for another attack that never came. When he finally checked his watch, it was 3:18 a.m., approximately 2.5 hours until sunrise. David maintained his vigil until visibility improved enough to ensure he wouldn't be ambushed during his withdrawal. The psychological impact of this encounter fundamentally changed David's relationship with wilderness areas. Despite decades of successful hunting, camping, and wilderness survival experience, he never again entered forest areas alone after dark. I moved to Alabama shortly after that night and stayed there for 25 years, David explains. Industrial work, urban environment, as far from wilderness as I could get, but life has a way of bringing you full circle. In 2015, family circumstances brought David back to Tennessee, to a property that provided a clear view of the cliffs where his encounter had occurred decades earlier. The house sat on 32 wooded acres that served as a wildlife corridor between the mountain forests and river bottoms. David's daughter had been living there with a large aggressive dog named Buddy, an animal known for successfully defending the property against coyotes and other natural predators. Shortly after David moved in, Buddy began exhibiting unusual nighttime behavior. The dog would bark and howl with extreme agitation, focusing his attention on the woods while repeatedly glancing back at David as if seeking reassurance or backup. Buddy's behavior was completely different from his normal territorial responses, David explains. This wasn't the confident aggression he showed toward coyotes or other natural predators. This was fear behavior, but he was trying to protect me from whatever was causing that fear. After 3 weeks of increasingly intense nighttime disturbances, David finally heard what was agitating the dog. His property lights couldn't penetrate far enough into the thick brush to provide visual confirmation, but the sound was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving away from the property and deeper into the forest. My blood ran cold, David admits. After all those years, after moving hundreds of miles away, after convincing myself that night on the cliff was some kind of isolated incident, I was hearing those same footsteps again. Whatever these things are, they have incredible range, incredible persistence, and they remember individual humans. The footsteps were never heard again after that single night, but Buddy continued experiencing occasional restless periods for the next 2 years, as if responding to stimuli that David couldn't detect. David's research into local folklore and historical accounts reveals consistent descriptions across multiple generations. Large, bipedal, powerfully built creatures with ape-like characteristics, covered in dark hair, emanating powerful odors, and demonstrating intelligence that exceeds any known North American wildlife. The unique aspect of Tennessee encounters is the consistent reference to whistling or bird-like vocalizations used for communication and possibly hunting coordination. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I experienced, David concludes. Military training teaches you to identify and categorize threats based on known parameters. But these creatures operate outside those parameters. They demonstrate strategic thinking, long-term planning, acoustic mimicry, evidence manipulation, and coordinated tactical behavior that suggests intelligence comparable to human-level problem-solving abilities. Both Marcus and David share similar psychological impacts from their encounters. Despite extensive military training and wilderness experience, both men acknowledge that their confrontations with these creatures revealed the limitations of conventional weapons and tactics against unknown entities. More disturbing is the implication that these creatures view humans as potential prey rather than threats to be avoided. The strategic patience demonstrated in Marcus's encounter leading the Marines miles from their intended destination through sophisticated acoustic deception suggest planning capabilities that far exceed anything documented in wildlife behavior studies. David's multi-generational encounter pattern indicates that these creatures maintain territorial ranges, remember individual humans, and potentially pass information between different members of their species. The evidence manipulation observed in both accounts, removal of physical traces, strategic placement of false evidence, coordinated behavior patterns, challenges our fundamental understanding of North American wildlife capabilities. Perhaps most unsettling is the consistency of these encounters across different geographical regions, different time periods, and different witness backgrounds. These aren't isolated incidents or regional folklore, they represent a pattern of interactions between humans and something that is adapted to sharing our continent while remaining officially unrecognized by mainstream science. For Marcus and David, their encounters serve as permanent reminders that our understanding of North American wilderness is fundamentally incomplete. Something intelligent, powerful, and potentially hostile shares our forests, something that views humans not as apex predators, but as slow, poorly armed prey that can be hunted with patience and cunning. The next time you're hiking alone in remote wilderness areas, especially after dark, remember these accounts, listen carefully to the sounds around you, question bird calls that seem out of place or unusually coordinated, trust your instincts if something feels fundamentally wrong about your surroundings. Because somewhere in the darkness between the trees, something might be listening to you, learning your patterns, and deciding whether you're worth the effort to hunt. These veterans survived their encounters through training, preparation, and sheer luck. They're sharing their stories not for entertainment, but as warnings. The wilderness is far more dangerous than most people realize, and the greatest threats aren't the ones we learned about in survival manuals. Stay alert, stay armed, and never ever assume you're alone in the woods. If you made it this far, you're already different. You listened, you paid attention, and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive when others don't. Because the forest isn't empty. It never was. Subscribe if you want to stay prepared, because the next story might not end in survival. And next time, it might be you being watched. We'll see you in the next episode, if you make it back.